This is the fifth talk in a series. It's entitled 1938, The Age of Anxiety, The War of the Worlds as Metaphor. In the mid-1930s, a wooden dummy captured America. Charlie McCarthy, dapper and pugnacious, and at first generally unseen, sat on the lap of Edgar Bergen and cynically philosophized over the radio about the foibles of his human counterparts, including Bergen himself. People loved it. And the Charlie McCarthy craze swept the country. Dolls replicating McCarthy and his friend, Mortimer Snerd, began to appear everywhere. In every other store and advertising space, it seemed, there was some image or other of the monocled McCarthy in a morning suit and making wisecracks. And though the wooden dummy clearly couldn't drink coffee, the Chase and Sanborn Company, one of the best-known purveyors of ground coffee in the country, had no problem in becoming the sponsor of his radio show. The Chase and Sanborn Hour on WABC, then part of the NBC network, soon overwhelmed all ratings for its Sunday night 8 p.m. time slot. It was estimated that 27 million American households out of a total of 34 million had radios by 1938. This meant that the medium, then the sole direct channel into the home, reached as many as 97 million out of a total of 129 million Americans. Of this number, it's estimated that Charlie McCarthy spoke to approximately 30 million every week. Coffee sales were apparently doing well. But at a competitive network, CBS, the producers of the Mercury Theater on the Air, which unfortunately shared the same 8 p.m. Sunday night time slot as the wooden dummy, were having a fit. They were desperately trying to compete, but they were losing the Crosley ratings war by a lopsided 34-3, and they had no sponsor. In a frantic attempt to match WABC, the Columbia Broadcasting System had hired a talented 23-year-old actor-director named Orson Welles, who was teamed with a 34-year-old director-producer, Bucharest-born refugee and former grain dealer John Houseman. Welles had a deep, resonant voice and already created a sensation as the mysterious Lamont Cranston on Mutual Radio's The Shadow, in which he starred from 1937 through mid-1938. You may remember the line at the beginning of each program, "Who knows what evil works in the heart of man? The shadow knows." The voice was that of Orson Welles. Houseman and Welles had worked together on a number of federal theater projects of the WPA and had created a sensation with the Harlem Theater production of the Voodoo Macbeth, a first of its kind. The Voodoo production featured an all-black cast, including a genuine troupe of African voodoo drummers. And to add yet another air of authenticity, Welles and Houseman had reportedly sacrificed a live goat in the basement of the theater. The Voodoo Macbeth opened to a sold-out house and an estimated 10,000 people hovering in the street outside. All of the New York critics loved the show. All that is, except right-wing drama critic Percy Hammond of the Herald Tribune. He panned it as just another wretched example of New Deal excess. Hammond promptly contracted pneumonia and died a few days later after his review appeared, adding to the aura of the Voodoo Macbeth and to the mystique surrounding Welles and Houseman. Sunday night, October 30th, 1938, All Hallows Eve, was the night before Halloween, also known as Mischief Night. Most families, such as my own, were on the lookout for kids with soap. It was torture to get that stuff off your windows. But Welles and Houseman had a different kind of mischief in mind. They would invade the dummy's ratings by staging a dummy raid of their own. This one on the entire United States. The raid would emanate from the red planet Mars, and it would track the H.G. Wells saga, The War of the Worlds. Originally published in 1898, Wells' work, along with his previously published Time Machine, was one of the progenitors of the literary genre we now know as science fiction. It was a vivid dramatization of man's vulnerability to an infinitely superior alien intelligence. And the listeners on that All Hallows Eve in October 1938 proved exceptionally vulnerable. Since the Mercury Theater's ratings were low, very few listeners had tuned in when the program began. Most were listening to the dummy. Had they tuned into the Mercury Theater, they would have heard a perfectly perfunctory, rational explanation of what was to follow. Namely, that it was merely a dramatization of Wells' well-known science fiction classic. Wells' book, which had been published both before the Boer War and the First World War, had envisioned a kind of Armageddon of both mechanized and chemical warfare. It had already proven ominously prescient of the human techniques of mass destruction which followed its publication, particularly the poison gas attacks of World War I. The Chase and Sanborn Hour had programmed numerous station breaks. Business was good. After the first Chase and Sanborn station break, however, 12 minutes into the broadcast, as Nelson Eddy began singing the Neapolitan love song on WABC, it's estimated about 12% of the listening audience, 4 million souls, flipped their dials and unfortunately happened upon the Mercury Theater of the Air. The drama was already developing in a devious way. The program had begun with an innocuous presentation of the soothing dance music La Comparsita, conducted by one Raymond Rochello, a Latin bandleader since confined to the dustbin of obscurity. A fictitious announcer named Phillips broke in and from time to time began harmless announcements about reports from an observatory at Princeton citing some unusual gases on the planet Mars. Then, with increasingly threatening reports of sightings in a New Jersey farm in the very real township of Grover's Mill, picked, it turns out, by scriptwriter Howard Koch, randomly punching a pencil at a map. A listener just aimlessly flipping around the dial at that point would have heard this. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Carl Phillips again at the Wilmuth Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey. Well, I hardly know where to begin to paint for you a word picture of the strange scene before my eyes. Like something out of a modern Arabian Nights. Well, I just got here. I haven't had a chance to look around yet. Yeah, I guess that's it. I guess that's the thing directly in front of me. Half buried in a vast pit. Must have struck with terrific force. The ground is covered with splinters of a tree. It must have struck on its way down. What I can see of the object itself doesn't look very much like a meteor. At least, not the meteors I've seen. It looks like a huge cylinder. The reporter was by this time accompanied by a fictitious Princeton astronomer identified only as Professor Pearson, who added yet another air of authenticity to the developing drama. Wells technicians played a sound device into the microphone, emulating the unscrewing of the gigantic spaceship lid. Actually, it was a crockery cookie jar being unscrewed in a toilet bowl. And the petrified reporter Phillips proceeded to describe a tentacled squid-like Martian creature as it emerged from the capsule. It was as large as a bear, and it glistens like wet leather. I can hardly force myself to keep looking at it. The eyes are black and gleam like a serpent. The mouth is V-shaped with saliva dripping from its rimless lips, which seem to quiver and pulsate. And that was the good news. The announcer and the professor went on to describe the play-by-play as the Martian creature and its companions proceeded to unleash a devastating heat ray on a crowd that had gathered at the Grover's Mill farm. Eventually, the ray was unleashed on poor Phillips himself. The signal went dead. Confusion reigned back at the radio station. He was not unlike the very real Hindenburg Zeppelin disaster just the year before, the first such catastrophe ever broadcast live on radio. Not knowing what to do, the station filled the dead air with a piano interlude of Claire de Lune. This was an irony that only Wells and Hausman could possibly have dreamed up. Then came bulletins of the death toll at Grover's Mill, horrendous. Martial law was declared in New Jersey. Red Cross emergency units had been dispatched to the scene. Then the coup de grace, an announcement from a fictitious vice president of operations of the Columbia Broadcasting System, confirming that the strange beings were indeed the vanguard of an invading army from Mars. The army from Mars marched implacably toward New York, easily defeating our army, spewing poisonous gas. Almost immediately following that came an inspiring pep talk from the so-called Secretary of the Interior of the United States, whose voice sounded unmistakably like that of FDR himself, imploring his fellow Americans in doomsday tones to remain calm and to pray so that we may confront this destructive adversary with a nation united, courageous, and consecrated to the preservation of human supremacy on this earth. The easy defeat of our army was readily believable to many Americans, and the memory of gas warfare was still fresh in the minds of many. Moreover, the bulk of the public already believed from reports by such notables as Charles Lindbergh and Joseph P. Kennedy that Adolf Hitler was invincible, and that our armed forces were woefully antiquated and they were totally unprepared for war. Suffice it to say that those who flipped their dials that night never flipped back to the dummy. Instead, most flipped out. They were too busy calling relatives and friends and warning them to get away. Where to? Anywhere. Just get away. Now, there was panic in the streets. Men and women wept openly. People ran haphazardly, covering their faces with wet towels and awaiting certain death. Others drove their cars wildly and without destinations, careening through stop signs and stoplights, oblivious to pedestrian traffic. Phones were jammed. Those who couldn't reach loved ones by phone to say goodbye because of the overload simply assumed that an intelligence superior to our own had managed to destroy our communication system. A Princeton University study 2 years after the event estimated that at least 1.7 million people felt that the situation was real, and of these, 1.2 million panicked. That's a lot of panic. None of those bothered to switch stations to check. None looked up the radio schedule in the local newspapers that day. All had missed the announcement, of course, at the start of the Mercury broadcast, and by the first station break, which came well into the broadcast, remember, no sponsor. They were already off somewhere, frantic and in a state of shock. Imaginations ran wild. People in the vicinity of Grover's Mill fired shotguns at a gigantic Martian rising high up on metal legs. Like the legendary Don Quixote, they were actually fighting a windmill. But this windmill was abandoned and had lost its fan. The ultimate irony, those shooting at it had lived in Grover's Mills all their lives. Today, the windmill is a tourist attraction, especially attractive to foreign visitors around Halloween time. The Cranberry Fire Department, 5 miles from Grover's Mill, received dozens of reports of fires in the woods, all non-existent. Farmers with shotguns roamed the countryside looking for the Martians. Hospitals in Newark treated 15 men and women for shock and hysteria. But the reaction was not confined to New Jersey. Word quickly spread around the country. After a frantic search, I learned, my Uncle Aby was discovered crawling under the dining room table. Of course, Uncle Aby was always a bit unusual, sort of a black sheep. The governor of Pennsylvania, completely taken in, offered troops to New Jersey to help contain the invaders. People in Boston crowded onto a rooftop and imagined they could see fires burning in New York. In concrete Washington, out on the West Coast, the power failed, just as the CBS Martians were interrupting communications lines. Mass hysteria followed. People fled into the streets and were, of course, cut off from the eventual station break that would have allayed their fears. Author Ray Bradbury relates this tale close to the alleged scene of the landing. Another local at Grover's Mills was in such a hurry to drive off to reach his wife's family in Pennsylvania, he neglected to open the garage door first, and despite his wife's screaming warning, drove right through the door with a crunch, shouting back to his hysterical wife, "Well, we won't be needing it anymore anyway." Similar stories were legion. Bradbury tells of another Grover's Mill neighbor who had emptied a bottle of whiskey while listening to what he was sure was his last broadcast. After deciding that his chow dog would be much safer in the kennel outside, he grabbed the dog and attempted to fling him over the fence into the kennel. The terrified animal grabbed his master's coat sleeve, clamping down with his jaw and held on for dear life. The man swung the dog over his head several times until the coat sleeve with the dog attached ripped off and the dog flew over the fence toward his kennel, sleeve attached. Church services instantaneously became Apocalypse Now meetings, especially in the South. But another interesting set of reactions was also discernible. A number felt that the Martians were either Germans or Japanese, prompting these erratic quotes. "I knew it was the Germans trying to gas us all. When the announcer kept calling them people from Mars, I just thought he was ignorant and didn't know yet that Hitler had sent them all." Then there was the Trojan horse meteor variation. The meteor was just a camouflage. It was really an airplane like a Zeppelin that looked like a meteor, and the Germans were attacking us with gas bombs. On another, the Jews are being treated so terribly in some parts of the world, I was sure someone had come to destroy them. Just before the last station break, the script ended with a pathetic plea from a shortwave operator from some remote outpost. 2X2L calling CQ. 2X2L calling CQ. New York, isn't anyone there? Anyone on the air? Isn't anyone there? 10 minutes later, as the program ended and the Mercury Theater signed off the air, the police charged into the studio, confiscating the scripts, surrounding the actors. But they didn't know what to do with them. Remarkably, no one had died as a result of this show. No crime had been committed. At least they hadn't figured out one that fit. Most of the injury were bruised egos. The print media, which were unhappy about the loss of advertising revenues to radio in general, were merciless in their interrogation of Wells and Hausman in the studio that night and vilified them in the morning papers, reporting that lawsuits were being threatened for millions. None materialized. For 3 days, the future of the Mercury Theater on the air hung in the balance, while executives at CBS tried to measure the fallout. They couldn't decide whether Wells and Hausman were the devil incarnate or the best discovery since sliced bread. Then the tide turned. The Campbell Soup Company offered to sponsor the program. Wells and Hausman had become instant stars. The Mercury Theater was renamed the Campbell Playhouse and debuted on December 9, 1938, just 10 days after the War of the Worlds broadcast. The program continued on the air until 1940 and ranked right up there with Jack Benny, Burns and Allen, and the Lux Theater of the Air with Cecil B. DeMille. The fallout from the whole incident was perhaps best summed up in a telegram from Alexander Woollcott to Wells, which read, "This only goes to prove, my beamish boy, that all the intelligent people were listening to the dummy, and all the dummies were listening to you." But in historical retrospect, the incident is really a fascinating barometer of the time in which it took place. The USA, fall 1938. It's a perfect metaphor, really, for our state of mind at the time. But why was this spoof able to send such shockwaves throughout the country, virtually paralyze the nation? Why were Wells and Hausman able to elicit such paroxysms of fear and anxiety and frenzy from their listening audience? What was the atmosphere prevailing in our country at that particular moment in history, October 30, 1938? To begin to understand this phenomenon, it's necessary to explore the state of international and domestic affairs prevalent at that time and its effect on our national psyche. First, it was an atmosphere of fear. Second, it was an atmosphere filled with hatred. Third, it was an atmosphere full of forlorn hope and longing for heroes. Finally, it was an atmosphere desperately seeking panaceas to replace a seemingly failed domestic and international policy. First, the paralysis of fear on the domestic scene. On the domestic front, by 1938, the hope spawned by the prolific and widely hailed therapy administered during FDR's first 100 days had worn off. The bulk of the New Deal programs were proving unsuccessful. They simply did not thwart the economic depression. And it was thus a time of frustration, as evidenced from above by an almost irrational lashing out by FDR in an unprecedented attack on the separation of powers, namely his abortive attack on the Supreme Court. From below, the economic depression, which had seemed to be lifting in 1937, had now reasserted itself with a vengeance. By March of 1938, the stock market had lost one half of its value. Corporate profits had dropped by 78%, industrial production down by 40%. All of this resulted in a hoarding of savings and a reluctance to spend on the part of the working public, which only, of course, served to exacerbate the dilemma. People were afraid that they would be left to starve once again. Well, the paralysis of fear on the international front. On the international front, on October 30th, 1938, when Wells and Hausman took to the airwaves, Adolf Hitler's star was in the ascendancy. In short order, in the year 1938, he had annexed Austria via Anschluss, And October 1, only 30 days before Wells and Hausmann's infamous broadcast, Czechoslovakia had been sacrificed by Britain and France via the Munich Pact. In England that September 1938, as Hitler raged on, making increasing demands on Czechoslovakia, signs of war panic abandoned. Gas masks were being handed out. Trenches were being dug in the parks. The evacuation of school children in the countryside had already begun. Long lines of applicants stretched around the bloc into the American embassy seeking exit visas before war began. On Saturday, September 29, 1938, Hitler met in Munich with Mussolini Chamberlain Daladier. The latter collapsed in the negotiation, capitulating to Hitler's demands, succumbing to his empty promises, virtually surrendering Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain returned to England as a conquering hero, proclaiming peace in our time. But Churchill denounced Munich as a defeat without a war. We had to make a decision between shame and war, warned Churchill. We have chosen shame, and as a result, we shall receive war. Hitler retorted, once and for all, we request to be spared from being spanked by a governess. Churchill's warnings, however, were already proving prophetic only 1 month later, as Wells and Hausmann took to the airwaves with their drama. The seeds of fear were already planted on this side of the Atlantic. Hitler's apparent invincibility was becoming legendary, not only in Germany and Europe, but in the United States as well. German-American friendship committees were springing up throughout the country. T.H. Watkins reports there were over 800 fascist and openly anti-Semitic groups in the United States in 1938. Eventually, the German-American Bund, under its leader Fritz Kuhn, would hold a standing room only rally attended by over 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden. Churchill was in disgrace in England for denouncing the Munich Pact. In October, FDR, like Churchill, had just rebuked Hitler in a radio broadcast for shattering his empty promises in the Munich Pact, namely, that he would abide by the results of plebiscites and international commissioners to decide issues over disputed areas. Instead, as FDR reminded him, immediately following Munich, Hitler had already sent the Wehrmacht unopposed into Czechoslovakia, dismembering it, looting the treasury, taking control of the Skoda works, and achieving long-sought-after military supremacy in Europe. Now, these events in Europe had unsettled the American people, and FDR's pointed rebuke of Hitler just weeks before had frightened many of them. An increasingly emboldened Führer had just fired back at FDR for meddling where he didn't belong. And many now feared FDR's remarks would provoke a war with Germany. FDR's talk had angered others, particularly the growing group of isolationists led by Gerald Nye in the Senate, and of course, avowed Nazi sympathizers who at that time included influential notables such as Charles Lindbergh, Father Charles Coughlin, and Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy. Moreover, FDR's attempts to aid the victims of Axis aggression by amending the Neutrality Act, which prohibited the export of arms to the Allies in the case of war, had met fierce opposition in Congress. In all, there was a pervasive tension and a nervousness centering on things military, foreign, and beyond our control. All of this was undoubtedly reflected in the frenetic reaction to Wells and Hausmann's wild radio creation. It turns out, ironically, that we had been misled, just as the principal players at Munich had been cleverly misled by the Luftwaffe. The so-called state-of-art German Air Force in 1938, described by Lindbergh to Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, was in fact a myth. In reality, the German Air Force at that time was small, and the bulk of it was obsolete. Documents and reports by the German Air Command, which surfaced after World War II, revealed that the Luftwaffe was undergoing a major overhaul in 1938 and was not in condition to fight either the French or the Royal Air Force. William L. Shirer concluded that had Britain and France gone to war with Germany at that time, they would have won and the threat would have been over. The Lone Eagle, both willing and gullible, had unwittingly played a part in grossly overestimating German air power. He had been wined and dined continuously by Hermann Goering and members of the German Air Command. He had been treated to carefully programmed tours of German factories, hangars, and airfields, shown a number of modern Henkels, Focke-Wulfs, Junkers, Messerschmitts, and had even been invited to take the controls of several of them, including a German Storch training plane, its maneuverability and the maneuverability of many of those planes had impressed him. We now know that most of the hangars that had been seen from the air by Lindbergh were in fact empty. Many of the planes he saw from the air were wooden models. The numbers of serviceable German aircraft which were not obsolete had been exaggerated by 300%, as had Germany's ability to manufacture aircraft. Lindbergh had estimated 8,000 per year. We now know the true number at the time was closer to 3,000. Tragically, Lindbergh's misleading reports to Joseph P. Kennedy and to French Air Minister Lechambre eventually reached Chamberlain and Daladier and were a major factor in French and British capitulation at Munich. Lindbergh, who was so taken with the German people, the master race theory, and the Nazi regime that he wanted to make Germany his permanent home, was rewarded by Field Marshal Hermann Göring on October 18, 1938, with the Service Cross of the German Eagle, by order of the Führer, an award which he proudly wore on a number of occasions, but which Anne Morrow Lindbergh came to call the Albatross. This was the same decoration, incredibly, that had been awarded to and accepted by Henry Ford only 2 months earlier. All of this mythical military and air supremacy with which our country had been bombarded played its part in the shock treatment administered by Wells and Hausmann's War of the Worlds as well. But what about events which had preceded the Anschluss in Munich of 1938? Starting in 1936, following Hitler's bold march into the Rhineland, which was curiously unopposed, the American public had witnessed the meltdown of anti-nationalist forces in Spain before a coalition of conservatives and fascists aided by Hitler and Mussolini. All of this took place despite the efforts of cadres such as the Abraham Lincoln and Washington Brigades, volunteers from here and abroad that had fought alongside the Republicans until 1939, which finally saw the crowning of Generalissimo Franco's dictatorship. We sat silent and presumably helpless as the Italian fascists invaded and overwhelmed a solitary Ethiopia. On the other side of the globe, we had witnessed Japan invade and subdue Manchuria for its natural resources in 1931. And in 1937, we saw war break out in earnest between Japan and China. Rumors of atrocities too horrible to describe circulated here. They were pictured, however, in grisly technicolor on so-called war cards, which we kids used to buy packaged with that awful-tasting bubble gum, and which were sold right alongside our baseball cards at the local transit stop. And our own American nationals had not been entirely spared. In 1938, the USA's Panay, stationed in the Yangtze River to protect American citizens in China, was sunk by Japanese warplanes in a bloody foreshadowing of Pearl Harbor. FDR sent a stern message to the Japanese emperor, who sent his regrets and promised not to do it again. But the American public was uneasy about Japan from that point on. These events, which long antedated Munich, were precursors as well of our state of mind on that All Hallows Eve, October 30, 1938. Americans desperately needed a hero. They got one. Only 2 days after the War of the Worlds, a horse named Seabiscuit, a bow-legged and malformed underdog, conquered the seemingly invincible war admiral in a one-on-one at Pimlico. The public erupted with joy. It was a sign of the times. But only 5 days after, reality set in as the flames of hatred in Europe were fanned once again. In Paris, a 17-year-old Polish Jewish emigre named Herschel Greenspan, distraught over the forced incarceration of Jewish relatives in Germany, shot and killed Ernst von Roth, third secretary of the German embassy. The Nazis, under a fake cover of official warnings against anti-Jewish excesses, looted Jewish shops, burned synagogues in Berlin, as they had burned those in Nuremberg, Munich, and Dortmund only months before, and began the deportation of 60,000 German Jews to concentration camps in what came to be known as the infamous Night of the Shattered Glass, or Kristallnacht. Many Americans shuddered as the news broke, but did nothing. FDR expressed surprise and shock that anything such as this could happen in the 20th century and temporarily recalled the American ambassador to Berlin. Hitler simply responded in kind. Nothing came of it. The world remained silent. At an international conference on Jewish refugees called by FDR at the French resort town of Evian, The rest of the world, with the exception of Denmark and the Netherlands, refused to afford them sanctuary. Even America's quota remained fixed at 27,370. Congress wouldn't budge. Hitler, emboldened by this inaction and by the world's silence, went on to perpetrate, of course, one of the greatest genocides in all of human history. And as this began, the levels of anxiety here rose yet another notch. And then there was hovering over the mindset, listening to the War of the Worlds that night, the mystique and fear of Hitler's Übermensch, the so-called pure Aryan master race. It was a mythical concept hypothesized in the pseudo-scientific writings of the Viennese political philosopher Guido von List at the turn of the century, and it had been celebrated in the popular operatic Ring cycle of Richard Wagner as Nordic myth. All of this had unfortunately played a significant part in formulating the demented Weltanschauung of the struggling young artist Adolf Hitler during his years in Vienna, 1906 to 1913. According to von List, the Aryans were from a continent near the North Pole. They had been driven southward by the Ice Age, where they had unfortunately mixed with inferior types. They were of a superior intelligence, destined by God to rule the world. Hitler's recent meteoric rise and the success of the German takeover, first of the Rhineland and now of both Austria and Czechoslovakia, had strengthened the myth of Aryan invincibility and conditioned the minds of a number of listeners on that All Hallows Eve, 1938, to the myth of a superior intelligence here on Earth or elsewhere, as is evident in a number of the quotes. One of those so predisposed, although he was not a listener to the Mercury Theater that night, was Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh, who had not even finished high school, had now fervently embraced a pseudoscience known as eugenics, and had even become a scientific colleague and co-author of its chief proponent in the United States, Alexis Carrel. Carrel was a former Nobel Prize winner turned fanatic. Much to the dismay of Anne Morrow Lindbergh, he had come to dominate Lindbergh's life and thought so thoroughly at one point that Lindbergh had moved his family to a small island off the coast of France named Iliac, where they had lived in isolation with Carrel, who exerted a stranglehold over their lives akin to that of a cult guru. Carrel's book, Man the Unknown, published in 1935, had sold 900,000 copies and topped the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction. In its final chapter, entitled The Remaking of Man, Carrel actually advocated that defective individuals and criminals be disposed of by society in small, euthanistic institutions supplied with gases. The book not only found a following in the United States, it was immensely popular among Nazi racial hygienists. So much so that Nazi scientists and physicians on trial for euthanasia in Nuremberg after the war claimed in their defense that their so-called experiments were based on the ideas formulated in the United States by Alexis Carrel. Lindbergh was of a mind with Carrel that Western democracies were in a phase of deterioration. He was enamored of Carrel's advocacy of racial betterment through selective breeding. And he clearly thought that the Nazis enjoyed racial superiority. These factors were much in evidence in Lindbergh's misinformed contribution to a joint report on German air power, prepared together with his close friend and U.S. military attaché in Berlin, Truman Smith, in 1937. That account, echoed in Lindbergh's later reports in 1938, which were so influential at Munich, speaks in hyperbole of a miraculous burst in German aircraft production, and claims that Germany's astounding growth must be accounted one of the most important events in our time. Significantly, it then credits the technical and scientific skill of the race in achieving this fantastically large air force. All of this racial superiority mythology then was swirling around the heads of our bewildered and fearful public in one form or another on October 30th, 1938, as the Mercury Theater broadcast began. What then of the atmosphere of hate? Conspiracy theories abounded. Many concerned the alleged communist menace and came to be associated by their proponents with the New Deal. The Dies Committee, eventually renamed HUAC, had veered sharply from the path for which it had been formulated by Congress, namely the investigation of fascist inroads here. It focused instead on such New Deal creations as the Federal Theater Project, which had given Wells and Hausmann their start. The German-American Bund, the German-American Friendship Committee, the Silver Shirts, the Knights of the White Camellia, the Ku Klux Klan, and similar hate groups which flourished seemingly unimpeded, lauded the work of the committee even when they were called before it to testify as window dressing. Anti-Semitism was rampant and open. Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest of the Radio League of the Little Flower of Jesus, who preached to over 30 million listeners, had been humiliated in the elections of 1936. He now dropped all pretense and turned to rampant anti-Semitism. Commencing on July 18, 1938, Coughlin, like Henry Ford before him, began to publish the notorious Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In his periodical Social Justice, Protocols were a slanderous fraud that had first appeared in the early 1900s as a propaganda piece of the Tsarist Secret Service, had long been discredited as sheer calumny. Now Coughlin, who had started out as a social crusader, often in the populist image, began to praise the German-American Bund and William Dudley Pelley of the Silver Shirts. The mysteriously and totally mad Pelley once testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee that we human beings actually choose our parents by our own free will before entering life as infants. This man was totally nuts. As Coughlin began to disparage FDR, however, his following lesson began to leave the mainstream and gradually grew into a frenetic personality cult. In August 1938, only 2 months before the War of the Worlds took to the air, Coughlin had organized his followers into groups of 25 members each, called Christian Fronts, to preach bigotry and hatred and to intimidate Jews by physical violence if necessary. It was a grim reminder to many of the havoc being wreaked on the Jewish community in Germany. While his program shocked and dismayed much of the Catholic lay and clerical community and their parishioners, surprisingly, he wasn't remanded to his parish in Royal Oaks, Michigan, until the Postmaster General barred his publication from the U.S. mail, and the Attorney General threatened to charge him with sedition for openly siding with the Axis during the Second World War. He was finally retired to Michigan. Hatred was not confined to the Jews. An anti-lynching bill had been introduced and then reintroduced every year since 1935. The bill finally reached the floor of the combative 75th Congress on January 6, 1938. Southern senators led by the infamous Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi and Allen Ellender of Louisiana filibustered endlessly. For 6 weeks, they filibustered and ultimately defeated the proponents of the bill as cloture votes in mid-February failed often to obtain the needed 2/3 majority. They openly preached a doctrine of white supremacy, warned their colleagues to beware of the potential of black and white amalgamation. FDR, the consummate politician, afraid of the Republicans making serious inroads into the Democratic strongholds of the Deep South, refused to actively support the anti-lynching bill, as he had refused actively to campaign to increase German Jewish immigration quotas. Amidst all of the darkness, there came a glimmer of hope for the black community, which found its hero in singer Marian Anderson. 6 months later, on Easter Sunday, she sang in front of the Lincoln Memorial before a crowd of 75,000 people. When Anderson had been denied permission by the DAR to sing in Constitutional Hall, Eleanor Roosevelt resigned from the organization. Harold Ickes and Eleanor Roosevelt promptly confronted FDR and persuaded him to make the Lincoln Memorial available. Harold Ickes introduced her with these words. "When God gave us this wonderful outdoors," he said, "and the sun and the moon and the stars, he made no distinction of race, creed, or color. Genius, like justice, is blind. Genius draws no color line." After that, Anderson was brilliant. The concert was magic. Thousands rushed forth to greet her, to touch her hand. There were tears in the eyes of most. Amidst the gloom and repression of the era, the black community had found a slim ray of light, and its hero, Eleanor Roosevelt, in one self-effacing, poignant gesture, had succeeded in restoring the faith of the black community in FDR, despite his faltering on the anti-lynching bill. So an atmosphere of fear an atmosphere of hatred, of forlorn hope, and a longing for heroes. What then of the panaceas we sought so desperately? The 1930s admittedly witnessed the worst prolonged economic depression in our history. Nonetheless, during the decade, no fewer than 4 U.S. cities chose to sponsor world fairs. The fairs were a sedative for a troubled nation. Chicago's Century of Progress, which opened on April 29, 1933, on the shores of Lake Michigan, was attended by 38 million people. Its theme, ironically, was to demonstrate man's power to prevail over the perils that beset him. The Texas Centennial Exposition in Dallas, the Frontier Centennial Exposition in Fort Worth, opened on June 6, 1933, ostensibly to celebrate the 100th anniversary of their independence from Mexico. They were an immense success. When they closed 6 months later, over 7 million people had visited and contributed handsomely to the economy of the state. 3 months after the War of the Worlds broadcast, San Francisco's Golden Gate Exposition opened. And only 1 month later in Corona, Queens, the enormous 750-foot spiked Tryon, thrusting defiantly to the future, and the globe perisphere, symbolizing world togetherness, debuted to great fanfare at the New York World's Fair. The theme was the world of tomorrow. The New York exhibits all looked to the future with great hope and exhilaration. It was as if we needed relief from the gloom and doom of the tenuous economy and the explosive world situation. But only 1 month before the New York World's Fair opened, Hitler had marched on an unprotected Moravia and Bohemia, which were all that remained of unfortunate Czechoslovakia. 3 weeks later, Italy invaded Albania. In 4 months, Germany and the Soviet Union would sign a non-aggression pact, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Only 1 month after that, on September 1, 1939, Germany would invade Poland, and Britain and France would join the fray. And although something of a lull ensued for a short period in Europe, which some came to call the phony war, both World's Fairs would finally close in June of 1940 as bombs fell on London. All hopes for a magic elixir of peace had now vanished. The country was looking for panaceas, building myths, dreaming of a world of tomorrow, trying to envision it as a world of peace and brotherhood. But it knew full well that the European continent was moving inexorably toward war. T.H. Watkin quotes Richard Reinhardt as saying of the Golden Gate Exposition, "The fair had been a sedative, a tranquilizer for frightened generation. We had understood this and accepted it with gratitude. We welcomed our brief oblivion and clung to our elusive innocence as long as the spell would last. In a world consumed by rage, there would be no further respites, no more innocent islands." So the War of the Worlds was shocking. It was sensational, it was cruel, and it ultimately proved a commercial success for its creators. But it was also a perfect metaphor for the times. It was a time when domestic paranoia was spawned by the apparent failure of the New Deal to cure the economic depression. And thus it is a time when the very real fear of starving once again haunted the American psyche. This, coupled with increasingly perilous developments abroad, served to engender that very fear of fear itself, the conundrum that had highlighted FDR's most famous inaugural address in 1933. It was a time when America, prompted by events in Europe, and particularly by the meteoric rise of Adolf Hitler, projected onto its fear of the unknown the chimera of a superior intelligence, a superior race. It was a time when a number of our people listened intently, although fleetingly, to crackpot theories of eugenics, which had already enveloped and enslaved much of Middle Europe in a muddle of hate. And it was a time when America looked on in horror and, assuming it was helpless, shut its eyes to the wholesale slaughter of the innocents which it knew was taking place abroad. It was a time when the humanistic ideals of the early New Deal years were coming under increasing attack and often succumbing to the minions of hate, the Fritz Kuhns, the Charles Coughlin's, the Theodore Bilbos, the Martin Dyes, precursors all of the McCarthy excesses of the late 40s and early 50s. It was a time when Americans desperately reached out for heroes, and some found them, although briefly in an underdog horse with an indomitable will to win and an underdog contralto with a magnificent voice and an unquenchable spirit. And it was a time when Americans built fairs, sought panaceas, dreamed of a future which lay beyond their reach in a world they knew was about to shatter around them. This then was the America that Mars captured for one unforgettable hour on All Hallows Eve in the year 1938. Thank you.